Black mechanic challenged by racist client, but she rebuilt the engine blindfolded. I'm not paying for a service that, frankly, I doubt was done correctly. Mr. Davenport's voice boomed across the garage, dripping with disdain. He glanced at Maya's grease-stained hands, then at her face, a smirk playing on his lips. A woman, and a black woman at that, working on my vintage Corvette. This has to be a joke. Maya, 32, the head mechanic at Apex Performance, one of Detroit's most respected specialty shops, felt her blood run hot. She took a deep breath, harnessing the composure she'd learned after a lifetime of microaggressions. Sir, I am a master certified technician. The problem was complex and I fixed it. Your car is running perfectly. Perfectly? He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Prove it. If you're so good, prove it right now. Take that engine apart in front of me and put it back together. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only she and the approaching shop owner could hear. Do it blindfolded. If you succeed, I'll pay you triple. If you fail, you quit, and you never touch a car in my presence again. This story is unbelievable, folks. If you've ever had to work twice as hard just to get half the credit, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you can follow this journey. And do me a favor. Comment with the city you're watching from and the word respect if you believe talent has no color or gender. The challenge was a trap, a public humiliation designed to break her. To accept was nearly impossible. To refuse was to admit the defeat he craved. Maya's reputation and the name of the shop were on the line, hanging by a thread of arrogance and prejudice. What Davenport didn't know, however, was that this challenge struck a much deeper nerve. This shop, this specific model of engine, it was all connected to an old promise and a family secret Maya had carried since she was a little girl. She looked at her tools, then at the man, a dangerous, determined glint in her eyes. Did this arrogant client have any idea that he wasn't just testing a mechanic, but awakening a legacy he could never possibly imagine? The silence in Apex Performance was thick enough to cut with a wrench. The other mechanics, men who saw Maya as a skilled peer, now looked at her with a mix of pity and shock. Challenging a wealthy client like Davenport was career suicide in this city. Frank, the owner, a man in his late 50s who usually avoided confrontation at all costs, looked pale. He shuffled over to Maya, whispering, "Maya, you don't have to do this. It's insane." But Maya tuned him out. Her eyes were locked on Davenport. More was at stake than her job. This shop wasn't just her workplace. It was her father James's legacy. It was James, a legendary self-taught mechanic from the heart of Detroit, who had taught Frank everything he knew. They had started Apex Performance together, but James's name was never put on the official partnership papers, a precaution in the 80s to avoid scaring off the high-end clientele. After James's early death, Frank had promised to look after his daughter, a promise he was dangerously close to breaking. Maya grew up among engine blocks and tool sets. When she was 12, her father blindfolded her and made her reassemble a carburetor just by feel. A real mechanic doesn't see the parts, they feel them, he used to say. That memory, that lesson, was her armor now. Mr. Davenport, meanwhile, was beaming. To him, this was pure theater. He crossed his arms, the arrogant smirk plastered on his face, ready to watch the public shaming of the woman who dared to challenge him. He didn't see a skilled professional. He saw an easy target, a chance to reassert his place at the top of the social food chain. Frank, torn between loyalty to his mentor's memory and fear of losing an influential customer, just stood there, paralyzed by his own cowardice. The stage for the showdown was set. "Fine," Maya said aloud, her voice steady and clear, shattering the silence. She moved with a chilling sense of purpose. Ignoring everyone, she walked to her workbench and began laying out her tools in a precise row. Each wrench, each socket, each ratchet, aligned like soldiers preparing for battle. The methodical clink of metal on metal was the only sound. She took a clean black shop rag from her drawer. "Use this," she said, holding it out to Frank, who took it with a trembling hand. Maya turned to face the disassembled engine of Davenport's Corvette. Frank stepped forward and tied the blindfold securely over her eyes. Total darkness. When Davenport realized she was actually going through with it, his grin widened. He decided to turn the screw. "To make things more interesting," he announced loudly for everyone's benefit, "you're on the clock. You have 90 minutes, starting now." A murmur went through the shop. 90 minutes was an aggressive timeline, even for a seasoned mechanic with perfect vision. For someone blindfolded, it was meant to be impossible. Frank shot a pleading look at Davenport, but the wealthy man just shrugged as if to say, "My rules." Leo, the youngest mechanic, who looked up to Maya as a mentor, balled his fists in anger. Another veteran mechanic, Phil, shook his head in disbelief, certain he was about to witness the end of his colleague's career. The conflict had escalated. It was no longer just about skill, but a race against time, a test of endurance under the most intense psychological pressure. Maya's hand hovered over the first engine component. Davenport's stopwatch started ticking. As Maya's hands began to move, identifying each part by weight, shape, and texture, another tense drama was unfolding. Frank was cornered by Davenport near the office. "I hope your employee knows her place," Davenport said in a low, threatening voice. "I've been patient with you, Frank. That investment we've been discussing to expand this shop, it hinges on my goodwill." The truth was, Apex Performance was on the verge of bankruptcy. Frank was counting on Davenport's investment to save the business his mentor, Maya's father, had helped build. He was trapped. Protecting Maya meant financial ruin. Sacrificing her was the only way to save himself, but it was also the ultimate betrayal of James. "In fact," Davenport continued with a sadistic glint in his eye, "this is even better. Let her fail. Fire her in front of everyone. Show me you're in control. Do that, and I'll consider our deal done." The pressure on Frank was crushing. He looked at Maya, whose hands were moving with a hypnotic fluidity, then at Davenport's smug face. The subplot was clear. The shop's survival was now directly tied to Maya's humiliation. The clock showed 15 minutes had passed. The sound of metallic clicks and the precise seating of components began to fill the silence. Maya worked in a focused trance, oblivious to her boss's existential crisis. She picked up the engine block and the crankshaft, her hands dancing over the cold metal with a familiarity that defied logic. She wasn't just assembling an engine, she was rewriting the power narrative within that garage, piece by piece, without even needing to see. 45 minutes had gone by, half the time, and to Mr. Davenport's growing horror, more than half the engine was assembled. Maya's speed and precision were inhuman. The atmosphere of entertainment had curdled into shock. Davenport's smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of disbelief, then panic. He could not let her win. It would shatter his authority. In a calculated move, while pretending to stretch, Davenport accidentally bumped the tool tray next to Maya. A small, vital, and nearly irreplaceable metal bolt clattered almost silently to the floor and rolled underneath a heavy air compressor cabinet. No one seemed to notice except Frank, who saw the deliberate act and froze to his core. Maya stopped. Her hands, which had moved with such certainty, were now still over the engine. The silence returned, but this time it was a silence of imminent failure. A collective gasp filled the shop. Davenport could barely contain his triumphant glee. Then, with the blindfold still covering her eyes, Maya slowly turned her head in Davenport's direction. Her voice cut through the air, calm and ice-cold. "Mr. Davenport," she said, "you just dropped the 1969 specific crankshaft calibration bolt. It's underneath the air compressor cabinet to your right. Please pick it up for me." Time stopped. The accusation wasn't just accurate, it was surgical. How could she possibly know which part fell, where it landed, and most shockingly, who dropped it? In that instant, the entire narrative shifted. This was no longer about a mechanic being tested. It was about an arrogant man being utterly exposed. Davenport turned pale, his mouth slightly agape, speechless. The admiration in the other mechanic's eyes turned to something approaching awe. Frank looked at the blindfolded woman, and for the first time in years he didn't see his friend's daughter. He saw the genius of James himself, reborn. Maya's revenge was just beginning. Davenport's spell of superiority was broken. Exposed as a petty cheater in front of everyone, he was paralyzed, the color draining from his face. The murmurs in the shop grew, morphing into looks of contempt aimed directly at him. Leo, the young mechanic, stared at Maya with an admiration that bordered on worship. He now understood he was in the presence of true mastery. In that moment, something inside Frank finally snapped. Cowardice gave way to a wave of shame and rage. He glared at Davenport with disgust and, without a word, strode to the cabinet, got on his knees, and retrieved the small bolt. He stood up, wiped the dust from the part, and walked to Maya. With a newfound solemnity, he placed the bolt in Maya's outstretched palm. His voice, though trembling, was firm and rang out across the shop. "Continue, Maya," he said, loud enough for everyone, especially Davenport, to hear. "No one is going to bother you again." The gesture was a declaration. Frank had chosen a side. He turned and shot a look at Davenport that promised severe consequences, a look that said, "Our deal is off." The power dynamic in the room had irreversibly inverted. Davenport, now the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, shrank under the weight of silent judgment. Maya didn't waste the moment on words. She simply closed her hand around the bolt, feeling its familiar shape. With a renewed calm, she went back to work. Her movements, once fast and precise, now carried an extra weight, a furious intensity. Every part she fitted was a blow against prejudice. Every bolt she tightened was a step in reclaiming her father's honor. She was on the attack. Davenport's sabotage was the final external barrier. Once overcome, Maya's challenge became an internal one. She was no longer just trying to save her job. She was fully embracing who she was. The ghost of her father, the whispered lessons, the denied legacy. It all converged in that moment. She wasn't just a mechanic. She was the heir to a genius, and her performance was now a demonstration of power. Her movements became a spectacle of excellence, each action designed to dismantle Davenport's worldview and inspire those around her. She was no longer on the defensive. She was actively teaching a class on talent, history, and respect. Meanwhile, Frank's growth was cemented. Spurred by his decision, he marched to his office and unlocked a drawer. He returned holding an old framed photograph, a young Frank next to a smiling black man, both covered in grease in front of the shop's first, humbler facade. He placed the photo on the main workbench for all to see, a silent act of historical correction. Davenport's stopwatch now showed less than 5 minutes remaining. Maya reached the most complex part of the assembly, synchronizing the valve train and pistons, a job that demanded microscopic precision. The silence in the shop was absolute, everyone holding their breath. Her hands moved in an indecipherable blur, a ballet of touch and memory. With a final audible click, the last piece slotted into place. With one last turn of a wrench, the final bolt was tightened. Maya set her tool down on the bench. Her hands, steady and sure, came to rest beside the now complete engine. She remained motionless, the blindfold still on, her head held high. Davenport's time wasn't up yet, but her work was done. Perfectly. Time seemed to stand still. The completed silent engine sat like a trophy in the center of the shop. Davenport's stopwatch still had 2 minutes on it, but everyone knew time was now irrelevant. The real test was over. Davenport stared at the engine, then at Maya, his face cycling through shades of shock, anger, and fear. He had lost control, and he knew it. Frank stood beside the photo of his old partner, his back straight for the first time in years. By choosing to back Maya, he had rejected Davenport's money and saved his soul, even if it meant risking his business. The conflict was no longer about finances. It was about honor. The tension was no longer about if Maya could succeed, but about how her victory would manifest. Slowly, deliberately, Maya raised her hands to her face and untied the knot of the blindfold. She pulled it away, letting her eyes adjust to the light. They were not tired or angry. They were clear, sharp, and fixed on one man. She ignored the admiring gazes of the others, the relieved face of Frank, and focused solely on Davenport. The final seconds ticked away on the stopwatch, which emitted a quiet beep signaling the end of the 90 minutes. The sound broke the silence. Maya took a step forward. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire garage. "Time's up, mister." "Davenport," she said, sounding like a judge delivering a verdict. She gestured to the Corvette. "Care to turn the key?" The question was a final challenge, not to her skill, but to his courage. She was handing the power back to him, knowing full well he could do nothing with it, but confirm his own defeat. All eyes turned to Davenport. Cornered, humiliated, he had no choice. To back down now would be an even greater admission of guilt and defeat. With heavy feet, like a man walking to his own execution, he moved toward the car. Each step seemed to echo in the dead quiet shop. He opened the door, slid into the leather seat, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the key. He put it in the ignition. There was a pause, a moment where the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. He closed his eyes for a second, as if praying for a miracle, for the engine to stall, to backfire, to do anything but work. Then he turned the key. The result wasn't just a start. It was an explosion of sound, an instantaneous, powerful, and unbelievably clean roar. The V8 engine erupted to life with a sonic perfection no one in that garage had ever heard from this car. It didn't sputter, it didn't shake. It settled into a deep, harmonious rumble, the sound of flawless engineering. It was the soundtrack to Maya's absolute victory. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just watched, her calm posture radiating immense authority. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer a victim proving herself. She was the master who had delivered her judgment. It was then that Frank stepped forward, his voice rising above the engine's rumble. "This engine hasn't run this smooth since it was new," he said to the crowd. "Not since her father, James, first blueprinted it years ago." Then he turned to Davenport, who sat frozen behind the wheel. "The man in that photo, Mr. Davenport, that's James Price, the co-founder of Apex Performance, the man who built the reputation you thought you could buy today." The final blow had been dealt. The engine's perfect roar was the only possible answer. Davenport was crushed. Frank's revelation had hit him harder than any physical blow. He had not only been outskilled, but he had insulted the very legacy of the place he stood. Without a word, he turned the key, cutting the engine. The ensuing silence was even more damning. He got out of the car, avoiding eye contact with every single person in the shop. His arrogance had evaporated, leaving only an empty, humiliated shell. He walked briskly to the exit, a man fleeing the sound of his own defeat, leaving his perfectly tuned car behind. The moment the door swung shut behind him, the shop erupted. It wasn't polite applause, but loud, heartfelt cheering. Leo rushed over to Maya, his eyes shining with admiration. The other mechanics clapped her on the back, acknowledging not just her talent but her courage. Frank approached Maya and put a hand on her shoulder. Their eyes met. No words were needed. In that gesture were years of apologies, regrets, and a promise to make things right from now on. The relationship was mended, redefined on a foundation of mutual respect. Maya looked at the photo of her father, now in its rightful place on the workbench. She hadn't just defended her own honor, she had restored his. Her revenge wasn't an act of destruction, but an act of perfect creation. The conflict was resolved. Justice served by the undeniable sound of excellence. Epilogue, approximately 399 words. 6 months later, the large Apex Performance sign had been taken down. In its place, a new one, sleek and modern, gleamed in the Detroit sun. Price Performance Garage. Inside, the shop was transformed. It was cleaner, more organized, and the photo of James Price and Frank was no longer on a workbench, but hung proudly on the main office wall, visible from everywhere. Maya, now a full partner, was no longer just the head mechanic. She was a leader. She was often seen leaning over an engine with Leo, passing on not just the techniques, but her father's philosophy, to listen to the metal, to understand its language. Davenport's investment never materialized, and the first few months had been a financial struggle, but the story of what happened that day had spread like wildfire through the Detroit car enthusiast community. A new kind of clientele began to arrive. People who weren't just looking for a service, but for authenticity, for craftsmanship, and for respect. They came not for the prestige of a name, but for the genius of the hands that worked there. Frank, freed from the weight of his secret, looked 10 years younger. He handled the business side with a new energy, proud of the partnership he had finally made right. One evening, as the shop emptied out, Maya stood alone for a moment. The silence was broken only by the gentle ticking of a cooling engine. She looked at her family name on the wall and smiled. She understood that the most lasting revenge wasn't to destroy an enemy, but to build a legacy so strong it could never be ignored or insulted again. The perfect rumble of an engine was the sound of her family's name, finally honored and immortalized. What a story of skill, legacy, and putting haters in their place. It's proof that talent and character will always win out over arrogance and prejudice. The sound of that engine starting is the sound of respect being earned and demanded. We want to know what you felt in that exact moment. What went through your mind when Davenport turned that key? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. If you watched all the way to the end, drop a comment with "I watched till the end," so we know who the real ones are. Your support is what allows us to keep finding and telling these incredible stories. And most importantly, don't click away. Another amazing story of an unexpected comeback is waiting for you right here on the end screen that's popping up now. Tap that screen. You will not regret it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.